Dahomey. The Dahomey Kingdom was founded in the early 17th century CE when the Aja people of the Alata Kingdom moved northward and settled among the Fon. They began to assert their power a few years later. In so doing, they established the Kingdom of Dahomey with its capital at Ogbom. King Haugbadia organized Dahomey into a powerful centralized state. He declared all lands to be owned by the king and subject to taxation. Primogeniture in the kingship was established, neutralizing all input from village chiefs. A cult of kingship was established. A captive slave would be sacrificed annually to honor the royal ancestors. During the 1720s, the slave-trading states of Wida and Alata were taken, giving Dahomey direct access to the slave coast and trade with Europeans. King Agadia attempted to end the slave trade by keeping the slaves on plantations producing palm oil, but the European profits on slaves and Dahomey's dependency on firearms were too great. In 1730, under King Agaja, Dahomey was conquered by the Oyo Empire, and Dahomey had to pay tribute. Taxes on slaves were mostly paid in cowrie shells. During the 19th century, palm oil was the main trading commodity. France conquered Dahomey during the Second Franco-Dahomean War and established a colonial government there. Most of the troops who fought against Dahomey were native Africans, Yoruba. Traditionally, the Yoruba people viewed themselves as the inhabitants of a united empire, in contrast to the situation today, in which Yoruba is the cultural linguistic designation for speakers of a language in the Niger-Congo family. The name comes from a Hausa word to refer to the Oyo Empire. The first Yoruba state was Ife, which would later become the capital of the Ife Empire, said to have flourished in 1000 CE around a now deified figure, the first Oni, Oduduwa. Oduduwa's sons would be the founders of the different city-states of the Yoruba, and his daughters would become the mothers of the various Yoruba Obas, or kings. Yoruba city-states were usually governed by an Aba and an Iwarefa, a council of chiefs who advised the Aba. By the 18th century, the Yoruba city-states formed a loose confederation, with the Oni of Ife as the head and Ife as the capital. As time went on, the individual city-states became more powerful, with their Obus assuming more powerful spiritual positions and diluting the authority of the Oni of Ife. Rivalry became intense among the city-states. The Oyo state was conquered in 1550 by the Kingdom of Nupe, which was in possession of cavalry, an important tactical advantage. As a result, Alaafin-Orampoto, king of Oyo, was sent into exile. After returning, he built up an army based on heavily armed cavalry and long-service troops. This made them nearly invincible in combat on the northern grasslands and in the thinly wooded forests. By the end of the 16th century, Oyo had added to their domain the western region of the Niger, the hills of Togo, the Yoruba of Ketu, the Dahomey, and the Fon Nation. A governing council served the empire with clear executive divisions. Each acquired region was assigned a local administrator. Families served in king-making capacities. Oyo, as a northern Yoruba kingdom, served as a middleman in the north-south trade and connected the eastern forest of Guinea with the western and central Sudan, the Sahara, and North Africa. The Yoruba manufactured cloth, ironware, and pottery, which were exchanged for salt, leather, and, most importantly, horses from the Sudan to maintain the cavalry. Oyo remained strong for 200 years. It became a protectorate of Great Britain in 1888, before further fragmenting into warring factions. The Oyo state ceased to exist as any sort of power in 1896. Benin. The Benin Empire was ruled by the Kwo-speaking Edo people, and by the mid-15th century, it was engaged in political expansion and consolidation in the region. Under Obe Uere, the state was organized for conquest. He solidified central authority and initiated 30 years of war with his neighbors. At the time of his death, the Benin Empire extended to Dahomey in the west, to the Niger Delta in the east, along the West African coast, and to the Yoruba towns in the north. The Oba ruled with advice from the Uzama, a council consisting of chiefs of powerful families and town chiefs of different guilds. Later, its authority was diminished by the establishment of administrative dignitaries. In particular, Uere's grandson Oba Izagi eroded the power of the Uzama and increased contact and trade with Europeans. especially with the Portuguese, who provided a new source of copper for court art. After the 16th century, Benin mainly exported pepper, ivory, gum, cotton cloth to the Portuguese and Dutch, who resold it to other African societies along the coast. Women wielded political power in the empire. For example, the Queen Mother, who produced a future OBA, wielded immense political influence. Benin was never a significant exporter of slaves. By the early 1700s, the empire was wrecked with dynastic disputes and civil wars. It regained much of its former power in the reigns of Oba Arasoyan and Oba Akingada. In 1897, the British sacked Benin City. Sungbo Zaredo and the walls of Benin were built amid 1st millennium CE. Prior to 10th century CE, Niger Delta and Igbo, the Niger Delta, comprised numerous city-states with numerous forms of government comparable to those of the Swahili people in East Africa. These city-states were protected by the waterways and thick vegetation of the delta, some like Bani Kalabari and Wari had kings. Others like Brass were republics with small senates, and those at Cross River and Old Calabar were ruled by merchants of the ECP Society. The ECP Society regulated trade and made rules for members known as house systems. Some of these houses, like the Pebbles of Bani, were well known in the Americas and Europe. The region was transformed by trade in the 17th century CE. The Igbo primarily lived east of the delta, with the exception of the Anioma on the west side of the delta. The Igbo kingdom of Nri rose in the 10th century CE, with Ez Nri denoting its leader. It was a political entity composed of villages where each village was autonomous, independent with its own territory and name, and recognized by its neighbors. Villages were democratic, with all males and sometimes females a part of the decision-making process. Graves at Igbokuno contain brass artifacts of local manufacture and glass beads from Egypt or India, indicative of extra-regional trade. The Aro Confederacy was a political union orchestrated by the Igbo subgroup. The Aro people centered in the Irokuku Kingdom in present-day southeastern Nigeria. It was founded at the end of the 16th century. By the 18th and 19th centuries, their influence and presence reached across eastern Nigeria into parts of the Niger Delta and southern Igala. Later migrations, through pathways taken by caravan or via travel amid the Almoravid period, West African population may have introduced the 29 beta thalassemia mutation found in notable amounts among African Americans into the North African region of Morocco. Painted rock art from Manding peoples are found largely in Mali, where Malinke and Bambara peoples reside. The Manding rock art developed using black, white, or red paint. It's primarily composed of geometric art forms, as well as animal and human art forms. Some of the Manding rock art may relate to circumcision rituals for initiates. During the 15th century CE, migrations from the northern area of Guinea and southern area of Mali may have resulted in the creation of Manding rock art in the northern area of Mali, southeastern area of Burkina Faso, and Dogon country, slave trade. Following the collapse of the Songhai Empire in the 16th century CE, a number of smaller states arose across West Africa, including the Bambara Empire of the Lesser Bambara Kingdom of Karta, the Fula Kingdom of Kasso, and the Kanadugu Empire of Sikaso. European traders first became a force in the region in the 15th century, with the 1445 establishment of a Portuguese trading post at Arguing Island, off the coast of present-day Senegal. By 1475, Portuguese traders had reached as far as the Bight of Benin. The Atlantic slave trade began almost immediately after this. Based on the already well-established slave trading capacity of the Islamic world, with the Portuguese taking hundreds of captives back to their country for use as slaves, it began on grand scale after Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas and the subsequent demand for cheap colonial labor. In 1510, the Spanish crown initiated Spain's involvement in the Atlantic slave trade, and it was followed over the next centuries by other European states. By 1650, the slave trade was in full force at a number of sites along the coast of West Africa, and over the coming centuries would result in severely reduced growth for the region's population and economy. The expanding slave trade produced significant populations of West Africans living in the New World recently colonized by Europeans. The oldest known remains of African slaves in the Americas were found in Mexico in early 2006 and are thought to date from the late 16th to mid-17th centuries. As the demand for slaves increased, some African rulers sought to supply the demand by constant war against their neighbors, resulting in fresh captives. States such as Dahomey and the Bambara Empire based much of their economy on the exchange of slaves for European goods, particularly firearms that they then employed to capture more slaves. During the colonial era, the Dutch colonial authorities in West Africa were active in recruiting African slaves into the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, as it was believed that black Africans were more immune than Europeans to the tropical diseases present in the Dutch East Indies. Recruitment changed format after the Atlantic slave trade was abolished by European and American governments in the 19th century. For instance, 1831 was the first year when only volunteers were accepted for the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. Slavery in the Americas persisted in some capacity after the end of the Atlantic slave trade, till Brazil abolished it in 1888. Today's descendants of West Africans make up large and important segments of the population in Brazil, the Caribbean, the United States, and throughout the New World, a modern genetic research study of African Americans. In several major U.S. cities concluded that their common ancestry originated most prominently in Western Africa. Consistent with prior genetic studies and the history of the slave trade. Colonial period. Colonization of Africa. In 1725, the cattle-herding Fulanis of Fouta Djallon launched the first major reformist jihad of the region, overthrowing the local animist, speaking elites and attempting to somewhat democratize their society. A similar movement occurred on a much broader scale in the Hausa city-states of Nigeria under Uthman Dan Fodio, an imam influenced by the teachings of Sidi Ahmad al-Tijani. Uthman preached against the elitist Islam of the then-dominant Qadira Brotherhood, winning a broad base of support amongst the common people. Uthman's Fulani Empire was soon one of the region's largest states, and inspired the later jihads of Messina Empire founder Sekou Ahmadu in present-day Mali, and the cross-Sudan Tukulur conqueror El Hadji Martol. At the same time, the Europeans started to travel into the interior of Africa to trade and explore. Scottish explorer Mungo Park made the first serious expedition into the region's interior, tracing the Niger River as far as Timbuktu. French armies followed not long after. In 1774, it was noted that the extensive coastline and deep rivers of Africa had not been utilized for correspondence or commerce, even though maps in the same volume clearly show the Gum Coast, Grain Coast, Ivory Coast, and Gold Coast. Malaki Postlethwaite writes in this book, "It is melancholy to observe that a country which has near 10,000 miles seacoast and noble large deep rivers should yet have no navigation, streams penetrating into the very center of the country, but of no benefit to it, innumerable people without knowledge of each.
Alder.
Correspondence or commerce. Scramble for Africa." The scramble for Africa A was the invasion, conquest, colonization of most of Africa by 7 Western European powers, driven by the Second Industrial Revolution during the late 19th century and early 20th century, in the era of new imperialism. Belgium, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. In 1870, 10% of the continent was formally under European control. By 1914, this figure had risen to almost 90%. The only states retaining sovereignty were Liberia, Ethiopia, Igbo, Aza, Senecia, and Bunda, the Dervish state, the Ovambo kingdoms, most of which were later conquered. The 1884 Berlin Conference regulated European colonization and trade in Africa and is seen as emblematic of the scramble. In the last quarter of the 19th century, there were considerable political rivalries between the European empires, which provided the impetus for the colonization. The later years of the 19th century saw a transition from informal imperialism, military influence, and economic dominance to direct rule. With the decline of the European colonial empires in the wake of the 2 world wars, most African colonies gained independence during the Cold War and decided to keep their colonial borders in the Organization of African Unity Conference of 1964. Due to fears of civil wars and regional instability, placing emphasis on Pan-Africanism, In the scramble for Africa in the 1880s, Europeans started to colonize the inland of West Africa, as they had previously mostly controlled trading ports along the coasts and rivers. Samori Toura's newly founded Wassoulou Empire was the last to fall, and with his capture in 1898, military resistance to French colonial rule effectively ended. France dominated West Africa, followed by Britain. Small colonial operations were held by Germany and also by Spain and Portugal. Only Liberia was independent before 1958, after the slave trade died out. Denmark and the Netherlands sold off their small holdings. Britain operated from 4 small colonies on the West African coast: Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, Lagos, and the Niger. British trade in tropical products reached £4 million per year, and was entirely handled by a small number of resident merchants. There were no permanent British settlers or military bases. The posts were held entirely for trade purposes, and also as calling stations. London had no long-term plans to join them together or go inland. British diplomats negotiated military agreements with local tribes, who needed British protection from the expansionist Ashanti tribes. Britain fought repeated Anglo-Ashanti wars in the Gold Coast in 1823, 1824 to 1831, 1863 to 64, 1873 to 74, 1895 to 96, and 1900. Only the last 2 were clear British victories. French pretensions in West Africa were much more ambitious and involved not just trade, but rebuilding the French Empire and bringing new populations into the umbrella of French civilization and Catholicism. There were dreams of consolidating a vast African empire by expanding south from the Mediterranean into the Sahara Desert, moving east toward the Nile River, and moving south toward King Leopold's Congo, post-colonial period. Following World War II, campaigns for independence sprang up across West Africa, most notably in Ghana under the Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah. Ghana became the first country of sub-Saharan Africa to achieve independence in 1957, followed by Guinea under the guidance of Sekou the next year. After a decade of protests, riots, and clashes, French West Africa voted for autonomy in a 1958 referendum, dividing it into the states of today. Most of the British colonies gained autonomy the following decade. Out of the 17 nations that achieved their independence in 1960, the Year of Africa, 9 were West African countries. Many founding fathers of West African nations like Nkrumah, Senghor Modibo, Kaida Sylvanus, Olympio Hopout, Boini Siaka, Stevens, and Abubakar Tafawa Balewa consolidated their power during the post-independence 1960s by gradually eroding democratic institutions and civil society. In 1973, Guinea-Bissau proclaimed its independence from Portugal. It was internationally recognized following the 1974 Carnation Revolution in Portugal. West African political history since independence has been characterized by African socialism. Senghor Nkrumah and all embraced the idea of African socialism, whereas Hopout Boini and Liberia's William Tubman remained suspicious of it. 1983 saw the rise of socialist Thomas Sankara, it's often titled the Che Guevara of Africa, to power in Burkina Faso. Since independence, West Africa has suffered from the same problems as much of the African continent, particularly dictatorships, political corruption, and military coups. At the time of his death in 2005, for example, Togo's Etienne was among the world's longest ruling dictators. International conflicts have been few, with Mali and Burkina Faso's nearly bloodless Agadir Strip or a rare exception.